Hello, Dr. Kin here with a lecture from my Roman history class, although anyone is welcome to watch this who wishes. It is on the subject of Roman Republican poetics, particularly the poets Plautus and Catholis, who will be subjects of our seminars. But I'm going to go through the history of, well, significant chunks of the history of Latin literature and poetry, and talk about several writers in particular. One thing to bear in mind about Latin poetry and literature generally is it can be understood as the adaptation of Greek models. Um, that's not to say that the Romans didn't have anything original; they did, but the literature that survives that we have of theirs largely amounts to adaptations of Greek originals. Um, so the verse comedies of Plautus are the earliest Latin literature that has survived. Composed around 205 to 184 BC. The start of Latin literature is conventionally dated to the first performance of a play written by a Greek slave named Livius Andronicus in 240 BC, who translated the Greek New Comedy style for Roman audiences. And this would be a theme with later writers like Plautus and Terence as well, where some Greek original, usually a new comedy play by the poet Menander, is adapted for a Roman audience, written into Latin, but keeping much of the original. So Plautus and Terence further refine the borrowings from the Greek stage, and their verse is substantially the same as for classical Latin verse. The traditional meter, or the Greek epic meter, the dactylic hexameter, that's 12 syllables per line, with a dactyl, which is da 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 da, was introduced into Latin literature by a poet named Ennius, 239 to 169 BC, who's more or less contemporary with Livius Andronicus. Ennius molded a poetic diction and style suited to this important hexameter verse and provided the model for classical poets like Virgil and Ovid. The late Republic also saw the emergence of the neoteric or new poets like Catholis, rich young men from the Italian provinces who had some scholarly background and had read the Alexandrian poet Callimachus for inspiration, amongst others. There was a whole Alexandrian school of poetry which influenced Roman, particularly neoteric poetry. And Catulus would share the Alexandrian preference for short poems. So there are kind of two styles that we find running throughout poetry generally in the Roman world. And one is the longer epic style, like Ennius or later Virgil. And then there's the shorter, more in-your-face and terse style of Catulus, taken from the Alexandrian school. So let's talk about the old Latin poets. The first I'll discuss is Quintus Inius, born around 239 BC in Rudii, southern Italy, died around 169. He was an epic poet, dramatist, and satirist, and was probably the most influential of the early Latin poets, rightly called the founder of Roman literature. His epic poem was called the Annales, which means annals, like a history. It's a narrative poem telling the story of Rome from the wanderings of Aeneas down to the poet's own day. It was considered the national epic until Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and that supplanted it. The works of Ennius are lost to us. We have fragmentary bits of it, often quoted by other writers, but for the most part, Ennius is gone. Because of the place of his birth, he was at home in three languages. As he put it, he had three hearts: Oscan, that was his native tongue, Greek, in which he was educated, and Latin, which was the language of the army. And this is something to think about, of course, at the time. Remember, this is before the Italian social wars. When Ennius is alive, it's before the further integration of Italy into the Roman Empire. And so the allied states of Rome are really much more distinct than they would be in later years. So they have their own languages or dialects. and so Latin would have been Ennius's probably third language. He was taken, well, he fought during the Second Punic War, and he was taken to Rome by our good friend Cato the Elder in 204, where he earned a living as a teacher and by adapting Greek plays to the Roman stage. But he came to become friends with, or he became friends with, a number of the leading Romans at the time, including the elder Scipio Africanus. And he had a patron named Marcus Fulvius Nobilior, who eventually obtained Roman citizenship for him in 184 BC. So again, funny to think he's from Italy, but he's not a Roman citizen until his patron gets that for him. He introduces himself, Ennius, as a reincarnated Homer, addressing the Greek muses, so very much following the Greek model. And he uses, as I say, the dactylic hexameter, the meter of Homer, in his writing. He varied his accounts of military campaigns with autobiography, literary, grammatical erudition, and philosophical speculation. He excelled at tragedy, we're told. Titles survive of 20 tragedies of his adapted from the Greek, mostly from Greek titles by Euripides, including the Iphigenia at Aulis, Medea, Telephus, and Thyestes. Only about 420 lines remain from these plays that he adapted. But he was, from what did survive, it's clear that Ennius did possess great skill in adapting the native Latin meters to the Greek framework. And his plays on Roman themes were known as the Cebon Women, which will refer to that famous episode from, well, that Livy recounts, and others. And he wrote a play called the Scipio as well, which apparently was about, presumably, Scipio Africanus. In his Saturae, or satires, Ennius developed the only literary genre that Rome could call its own. So that, even though there are satiric elements in Greek plays, and the satyr play derives from Greek as a kind of comedy or farce, a particular type of satire is developed by the Romans, which is uniquely Roman. And in the case of Ennius, those satires concern practical wisdom and drive home lessons, usually with the help of a fable of some type or another. Ennius is credited, like many a great poet, some of his inventions influenced the language quite profoundly. So he's introduced the double spelling of long consonants and the invention of a Latin shorthand as well. He was very conversant with the intellectual and literary movements of the Hellenistic world. You have to think about Alexandria at this time, and Pergamum as well, where there's a library and university as well, where literary scholars are poring over the works of the classical writers from the 5th century and 4th century BC and writing essays about them and imitating their style and coming up with new inventions in literature based on the old. It is really the beginning of literary scholarship. And we owe a lot to modern literary scholarship owes a great deal to it. But then the Roman writers have the benefit of this because that's part of their education. Cicero and others admired the work of Ennius, and it's partly from Cicero that we have a number of his things quoted. Critical remarks begin to appear in the poet Horace, becoming more severe in Seneca and Martial. So as Rome develops its own poetic style, though again derived from the Greek, and becomes more sophisticated, they begin to see Ennius as somewhat rustic or primitive. The assertion to be Homer reincarnated situates Ennius within the memorial culture of the Roman nobility. Here's a quote from, well, that Cicero gives us from one of his poems. So this is there's a quote within a quote. So Cicero says, "I am speaking of political leaders, but do not poets also wish to be elevated to noble status after their deaths? How else would one explain the following?" This is the quote. "Gaze, fellow citizens, on the features of the image of aged Ennius. He composed a poem about the mighty deeds of your ancestors. He, says Cicero, insists on being given a recompense of glory from those whose ancestors he endowed with glory." So that was a kind of self-supporting quote from Ennius. The inscription Cicero quotes was attached to a bust or statue of Ennius on display in the public in the city of Rome. We have, there's a longer surviving fragment that I've put into the notes, but I won't read out now for your benefit, with Ovid commenting on it, again, well, making a bit of fun of its, making some fun of its rather rustic qualities. But it gets copied by other writers, so Virgil actually rewrites a scene of Inius's in Aeneid, Book 4. And it will be Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, that eclipses Inius's. So part of the reason why we don't have it, although we have the Aeneid intact from antiquity, because it was very popular. The next poet I want to talk about, and probably one of the more influential ones, and certainly one that we're looking at in class, is Titus Machias Plautus, or Plautus, born 254 in Umbria, probably, died in 184, a great Roman comic dramatist whose works, loosely adapted from Greek plays, establish a truly Roman drama in the Latin language. Very little is known of his life, and that's not unusual for a figure of this era in Roman history. He ranks with Terence, whom we'll look at in a moment, as one of the two great Roman comic dramatists, and his work presents scholars with a variety of textual problems, since the manuscripts by which his plays survive are corrupt and sometimes incomplete. So we have the Miles Gloriosus, the braggart warrior, more or less intact, although the version we have is quite long, and a bit like, well, Shakespeare's plays too. These could be shortened or lengthened depending on the amount of time that the performance was meant to take. According to a grammarian named Festus, 2nd or 3rd century AD, Plautus was born in northeastern central Italy. But even his names are uncertain. So the name Titus Machias Plautus is of questionable historical authenticity. For example, we know that those very names were often used as stage names by actors. So Maccus, for example, is a traditional name for a clown in a type of play called an Attilan farce that the Romans put on at the time, a long established popular burlesque native to the Neapolitan region of southern Italy. Plautus may well derive from a phrase meaning flat-footed, which was a common name for a pantomime actor. Yes, they had pantomimes. And there are further difficulties as well, because another poet, Lucius Akius, tells 170 to 86 BC, tells us that he mentions both a Plautus and a Titus Machias as if these were two different people. So his history, his biography, is largely lost to history. We do have quite a good selection of his works, though, or remnants of them, to talk about his quality as a poet. We're told he was associated with theater from an early age, and there's a story that he lost his profits from all the productions that he put on a kind of dodgy business venture, and then had to spend out the rest of his days earning a living by working in a grain mill rather. But in terms of his approach to drama, we're on a slightly firmer footing. As with most of his predecessors, and indeed his successors, Plautus would borrow most of the plots of his plays from the works of the Greeks, primarily the work of Menander, this new comedy playwright, and another one named Philemon. And just to remind you, some of you were in my ancient Greece module. You might remember New Comedy. It's non-political or apolitical for the most part. It's the comedy of situation, of romance. It's romantic comedy, essentially. It's the forerunner of the sitcom. So kind of formulaic, fairly formulaic. Young man falls in love with pretty girl, but her father doesn't want them to get together, or she belongs to another man, etc., etc., and the young man has to rescue her, and comedy ensues. Worth pointing out that the idea of borrowing or ultimately plagiarizing a play from an original source isn't considered a bad thing. It's not considered a bad thing until relatively modern times, when we get the idea of a copyright. So most ancient writers did this to some extent or another. of course, Plautus isn't just copying from the Greek plays, he's adapting them. So he incorporated into his adaptations concepts, terms, and usages that were uniquely Roman, but also ends up keeping a lot of the Greek elements in the plays as well. So he refers to towns in Italy, to gates, streets, markets of Rome, to Roman laws and the business of the Roman law courts, and to Roman magistrates and the duties, and to other Roman institutions such as the Senate. However, not all of his references are Romanized. He didn't set much store by consistency, apparently. So there are lots of Greek allusions that he left in his plays, which might have been unintelligible to his audiences, or they might have gotten, we don't know. Terence, when we get to him, is somewhat more careful in his adaptation of Greek references and criticizes Plautus for not being. Plautus's approach to the language in which he wrote is perhaps a more important feature of his writing. His action is lively and slapstick. I think I compared it in class to Carry On. It certainly has that quality about it. He was able to marry the action to the word as well, and in his hands Latin became racy and colloquial, verse varied, and choral as well. Hard to say if these derived entirely from the Greek originals or if they're elements of other native Latin dramatic traditions. We simply don't know, although some scholars think that sort of the slapstick elements derive more from other Latin traditions or other Italian traditions that are now lost to us. And Cicero admired his witty command of the Latin tongue. It's often been said that Plautus's Latin is crude and vulgar, but it is in fact a literary idiom, a kind of untranslatable way of expressing things based upon the language of the Romans of his day. And this is why studying a poet is important for historians, because it gives us a very keen insight into his world and time. The plots of his plays are sometimes well organized and interestingly developed, but often they just sort of provide a framework for scenes of pure farce. And often, well, the comic effect derives from exaggeration, burlesque, often very coarse humor, rapid action, and a deliberately upside-down portrayal of life in which slaves tend to get the better of their masters. Parents are hoodwinked by their sons who need money for girls, and the procurer or braggart soldier is outwitted and fails to secure the seduction or possession of his desired girl. He's outwitted by a slave, usually. Clever slaves seem to be a running theme throughout Plautus. And it would influence a number of later works as well. Though his original texts do not survive, some version of 21 of them do. But again, we're not completely sure that they are 100% his, because they seem to have been adapted by other playwrights in different eras. So the ones that do survive have been adapted, modified, cut, or expanded, and generally brought up to date for productions whenever they were produced. So again, it's difficult to establish a purely Plautine text, but modern editors have admitted it's ultimately impossible, but still surely something of the original in no small part must survive. They were still in production up until the time that Cicero was alive, so this is again why they end up getting adapted. Cicero praises their language. The poet Horace is more critical, considering them to lack polish. And we're told that St. Jerome, apparently towards the end of the 4th century, says that after a night of excessive penance, he would read Plautus as a relaxation, and other Christian scholars in later centuries apparently enjoyed Plautus as well. And the history of Plautus's plays goes on even further than that. So in the Middle Ages, we know he wasn't read much at all, in contrast to Terence, who was. But then by the mid-14th century, the poet Petrarch knew a number of his comedies, about 8 of them, and then the remainder came to light. As the remainder came to light, Plautus began to influence European domestic comedy after the Renaissance. A poet named Aristio had made the first imitations of Plautine comedy in the Italian vernacular. His plays would influence Molière, the French playwright, and Jean Giraudo's Amphitryon 38 from 1929. Cole Porter's musical Out of This World from 1950 is in no small part influenced by Plautus. And a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, film from 1963, derives almost directly from Plautus comedies. And you'll see a number of characters from Plautus, like the braggart soldier, being present in Italian Commedia dell'arte, but also in Shakespeare. His Falstaff owes something apparently to Plautus. And there's some trace of Plautine, character in Bertolt Brecht's Elif in Mother Courage and Her Children from 1941. So Plautus has a long history. Move on to the next poet whom I've been mentioning already. That's Terence, or Publius Terentius Afer. He's the second important writer of Latin comedies, and presents quite a remarkable contrast to the first. So he's probably a native from Carthage, a slave in the family of a Roman patrician, but on account of his witty conversation and graceful manners, he became a favorite in the fashionable society of Rome at the time. His dates are about 190 to 158, so just after Plautus's time, or coinciding roughly with it, but going into the next sort of era. Terence, again, favored of the fashionable society. That's very much his audience, the upper crust of Rome, whereas Plautus was writing for the masses. Terence's works, pardon me, as far as we know them, consist of two sorts: fairly close translations of Menander and contaminatios. And a contaminatio is where more than one play, Greek original, is put together to make this later Latin play. Plautus used contaminatios as well. Of the remaining, well, there are 6 extant plays from Terence, of which The Brothers, The Girl of Andros, and The Eunuch are contaminations. Each is made from 2 Greek plays, as I mentioned. Of the remaining 3, the Phormio is based on a play by the Greek Apollodorus, and the others are from Menander. So The Brothers was first performed in 160 BC at the funeral games of Aemilius Paulus, 229 to 160, who was a 2-time consul of the Roman Republic and a noted general who conquered Macedon. That's Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus. Terence, as I say, is very much an insider to the upper crust. The weakness of Terence lies in the lack of bolder elements of action. So his characters are somewhat deficient in variety, unlike Plautus's. His situations are inferior as well to those of Plautus, so that's the literary assessment. He is superior to Plautus in refinement and taste, but never equal to him in exuberance of spirit or comic force. So Plautus was kind of the untutored genius, and Terence was the conscious artist, if you like. Plautus was the practical playwright. Terence was the elegant literary craftsman. Plautus wrote for the crowd. Terence for the aristocracy. As with Plautus, when once the irregular situation is granted, the plays are found to be full of moral sentiments and advice of a prudent and wise nature. So both of these poets input morality into their plays, and that was expected. This is from a particular element from the Greek world, but also the Roman, that a poet is expected to teach some kind of morality. From the time of Plautus and Terence, it is possible to trace in European drama the same characters, the same plots, the same old themes of, say, a stupid husband outwitted by his young wife, the stingy father fleeced by his rascally sons, or the aged sensualist defrauded of his pleasures he is handsomely paid for. In Terence, however, unlike Plautus, the young people are somewhat superior to the prototypes in Plautus. The courtesans are more refined in speech and manner. The young men are not wholly libertines, but approach more nearly the type of a lover which the modern world enjoys in its fiction. The slaves are of a higher quality, and their masters are more decent, often treating them as trusted domestics. The braggart soldiers are not quite such fools, but more like witty roisterers or half philosophers. So take all the characters from Plautus, and up them a notch, give them more refinement. That's what you find in Terence. The result obtained by Terence rather is that while he has left no trace in any of his comedies of the sketching from the life by which he was surrounded, there is perhaps no more delicate, truthful, and natural delineator of human nature within the whole range of classical literature. So the reason, and this is why I asked my class to read Plautus, because he really is a mirror of the age. Terence is a mirror as well, but of a much more narrower version of it. Though without claims to creative power, Terence must have possessed not only the critical genius to enable him to fully appreciate and identify himself with his originals, but artistic genius of the highest and purest type. His position in Roman literature is this: he was the first writer who set before himself a high ideal of artistic perfection, and he was the first to realize that perfection in style, form, and consistency of conception and execution. It's as if a literary scholar is writing literature, which unfortunately, although artistically perfect, perhaps makes his work rather bland. So his humor is always more chaste and of a delicate complexion than that of Plautus. Here's a quote from Terence's Eunuchus, which goes: "All these vices are in love, injuries, suspicions, enmity, offences, war, peace restored. If you think that uncertain things can be made certain by reason, you'll accomplish nothing more than if you stayed at home, strive to go insane by sanity." Yeah. So there's Terence. He was widely read, and continues to be widely read, well, relatively speaking. The next late Republican poet I want to mention is quite important for a number of reasons, but not as you might expect in the literary realm. Well, yes, that too, but his greatest contribution is actually to the sciences, and this is Titus Lucretius Carus, or just Lucretius. As we can see from the writings of Cicero and others, there was a sense amongst the Hellenized elites of the late Republic that one ought to be conversant with literature and philosophy. And the two often went hand in hand in the form of what's called didactic poetry, or teaching poetry, which had been produced by the Greeks since the classical age, even before the classical age, arguably, and reaches its apex in the Alexandrian scholarly world after Alexander the Great. But perhaps the best example of this technique is taken up by the Roman writer in his long didactic poem called On the Nature of the Universe, De Rerum Natura, which combines poetic skill with scientific and philosophical theory. Alongside the tried and true approach, and certainly influenced by it, came an increase in the humanist interests, especially those of love and romance. In the late Republic, this style can perhaps best be seen in the likes of Catholis and the elegiac poetry of Propertius, whom we'll come to in a bit. Both reveal a style and a society in transition. So this is one of the things you can glean historically from these late Republican poets, a society in transition. In the case of Lucretius, he was an Epicurean poet writing in the middle years of the 1st century BC. What is an Epicurean? Well, I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a school of philosophy. It's one of two schools of philosophy from Greece that are prominent in Rome. The other one is Stoicism. His 6-book Latin hexameter poem De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of the Universe, or On the Nature of Things, but usually translated as On the Nature of the Universe, survives virtually intact, although it's disputed whether he lived to put the finishing touches on it. He's come to be our primary source of information on Epicurean physics. Among numerous other Epicurean doctrines, the atomic swerve is known to us mainly from Lucretius' account of it, and his defense of the Epicurean system is deftly and passionately argued, and is particularly admired for its eloquent critique of the fear of death in Book 3. We know virtually nothing of, beyond what little can be inferred from the poem itself, of Lucretius' biography. There was just one contemporary reference to him, or near contemporary, depending on the date of his death, to be found in a letter of Cicero's written in 54 BC, where he briefly argues with his brother about the flashes of genius and craftsmanship that characterize Lucretius's poetry. What we can say for sure is the poem is dedicated and addressed to a Roman aristocrat named Memmius, though it's not altogether certain which member of the Memmius family this was. Pardon me, Lucretius expresses a hope for his patron's friendship, for Memmius's friendship. It doesn't rule out a patron-client relationship. He could be a friend or a patron. We don't know. The other bibliographical data are late and untrustworthy. They put his death in 94 BC, his birth in 94 rather, and his death either in 54 or 51, although a case has been made for dating his death to the 40s BC. We can say with some confidence that Lucretius wrote his poem in the mid-1st century, and that's about as accurate as we can get on the date. Because early Christianity branded him an enemy of religion, his life and death had to be depicted appropriately wretched. So according to St. Jerome, he was driven mad by a love potion, wrote poetry in his lucid intervals, and died by his own hand, leaving his poem to be edited posthumously by Cicero. The whole story is incredible. It's not considered to be true, apart from perhaps Cicero editing his works. That is possible. The rest is a fabrication. The portrayal of wretched insanity is implicitly contradicted by Lucretius' younger contemporary and admirer Virgil, who writes in his Georgics, "Happy is he who was able to know the cause of things, and who trampled beneath his feet all fears, inexorable fate, and the roar of devouring hell." And that's Virgil, who is also an Epicurean, praising Lucretius. With these admiring words, Virgil neatly encapsulates 4 dominant themes of the poem: universal causal explanation, leading to elimination of the threats the world seems to pose, a vindication of free will, and disproof of the soul's survival after death. And these are all Epicurean beliefs. But Virgil is also, in advertising Lucretius' philosophical understanding as his enviable source of happiness, makes it implausible for the author to have committed suicide after being psychotic. Whether or not the poem is altogether finished, as Lucretius would have wanted, its 6-book structure is itself clearly a carefully planned one. It falls into 3 matching pairs of books. The first pair provides the permanent constituents of the universe, like atoms and the void, which is what the Epicureans believe, how atoms explain phenomena in the second pair. The third pair is the nature and mortality of the soul. The soul is made of atoms, the Epicureans believe, and when you die it just disperses. The fourth pair of books deal with phenomena of the soul. The fifth pair, the cosmos and its mortality. And the sixth pair, cosmic phenomena. So the sequence is one of ascending scale or order. The first pair of books deals with the microscopic world of atoms, the second with human beings, the third with the cosmos as a whole. And within each pair of books, the first explains the basic nature of the entity or entities in question. The second goes on to examine a range of individual phenomena associated with them. And a further symmetry lies in the theme of mortality, treated by the odd-numbered books. In addition to the division into 3 matching pairs of books, the poem can also be seen as constituted by 2 balanced halves. And sorry, I need to correct myself. I said there were 6 pairs. There are 3 pairs. What I went through earlier was actually the 6 books themselves. Sorry about that. The poem opens with a hymn to Venus as the force inspiring birth and life. Now, this is a curious thing, because the Epicureans do believe in the gods, but they believe the gods have nothing to do with us. The gods are perfect, in a state of perfect bliss. They're very far away. They're not concerned with human affairs. So why begin an Epicurean poem with a hymn to Venus? Well, it's been considered to be a kind of honeying the cup. So if someone needed to take medicine, if a child needed to take medicine in the ancient world and the medicine tasted foul, they would smear some honey around the edge of the cup that the medicine was in, So the child took that first and got the sweet flavor before taking the medicine. So the hymn to Venus might be a kind of honey or sweetening of the medicine, a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down, if you like. The poem then goes through the various subjects I've mentioned and concludes with a disquieting passage on the frightful Athenian plague during the Peloponnesian War. So it gives the reader a very disturbing, graphic scene of human suffering during the plague of Athens in the middle of the 5th century BC, or towards the end of the 5th century. Why do this? Well, there's been much dispute over the ending. Some judge it a poetically effective closure as it stands. Others believe that Lucretius would, had he lived, at least have completed it with a suitable moral. The former party maintains that Lucretius, by this point in the poem, is liable to leave readers to work out the moral for themselves. And the moral then seems to be that if you've been paying attention, you're not going to fear death. So even though this is a horrible thing, and yes, it's unfortunate those people suffered, death released them from that suffering, and you shouldn't fear it either. But again, this is a subject of debate. So, what about Epicureanism? Well, a few words on this philosophy are relevant because, as I say, Romans during this period tend to be one camp or the other. Normally, Roman aristocrats fall into the Stoic camp because they are more aligned with traditional religion, whereas the Epicureans, well, their beliefs about the gods are somewhat controversial and would become more controversial as Christianity comes along. So Epicurus founds this system in the early decades of the 3rd century BC. It was one of the most influential of the Hellenistic age. Lucretius lived in Italy in a period when Epicureanism flourished there, especially in the area of the Bay of Naples, where a major Epicurean circle had formed around a man named Philodemus. His library was rediscovered during the 18th century excavations of Herculaneum. In addition, the main Epicurean school was still flourishing at Athens at the time. Epicureanism was by now one of the 4 leading philosophical systems that any aspiring philosophy student was expected to master. Romans who, against this background, became Epicureans included Cicero's friend Atticus and Cassius, later the assassin of Caesar, Virgil, as I mentioned as well. It therefore became both easy and attractive to think of Lucretius turned to Epicureanism as a part of a trend towards the Roman intelligentsia, among the intelligentsia. Curiously, however, his poem shows few, if any, signs of contemporary philosophical or scientific engagement. And that's a curiosity because you'd almost expect him to reference Epicureans from his time, but it's as if he's got a book written by Epicurus himself, which we know existed but didn't survive to our era, and he's almost not transcribing but adapting those into poetry. And we find little or no evidence in Lucretius' poem that he's aware of, let alone engaged with, those contemporary developments. An underlying principle of Lucretian Epicureanism is that of atomic theory. This was developed by Democritus and found its way into Epicurean thinking, Democritus in the 5th century BC. According to this theory, everything is made of atoms, including the soul, which is therefore not immortal, and the gods themselves are also made of atoms. So here's a quote from Book 5 of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the universe. It illustrates that Lucretius was not actually an atheist, though it does reveal his attitude towards divinity to be markedly different from that of most Romans. He writes, "Another thing you cannot believe is this, that holy dwelling places of the gods can exist in any regions of this world. For the nature of the gods is thin and far removed from our senses, and is hardly perceived by the mind. We cannot touch it with our hands, therefore it cannot touch anything that we can touch. For that cannot touch which cannot itself be touched. Wherefore, their dwelling places must also differ from ours, being thin, like the thinness of their bodies. This I will prove to you later at some length." Further down in the same section, he argues that it is pointless to pray to the gods for anything, as people tend to do on account of their natures. He writes, "For what gift of gratitude on gods immortal blessed can we bestow, that for our sakes they should do anything? And what new thing after so long a time would tempt them in their blessed tranquillity to wish to change their old life for a new?" So he's essentially saying, what's the point of giving gifts, of sacrificing to the gods? There's nothing we can do to persuade them to help us, because their lives, their existence is totally perfect, and they're very far away. Lucretius was admired and imitated by writers in the early Roman Empire, although in the eyes of Roman patristic thinkers, like Lactantius, the Christian scholars who came later, he came to be the leading spokesman for the godless Epicurean philosophy. His poems survived in two 9th century manuscripts known as O and Q, which were discovered by Poggio Bracciolini in 1417 and became the basis of the Renaissance editions. Pardon me. His ideas, when they re-emerged in the Renaissance, were met with some negativity. He struggled for 2 centuries, in fact, to shake off the pejorative label of an atheist. But he became a key influence on the emergence of early modern atomism in the 17th century, a development above all due to a man named Pierre Gassendi and his construction of an atomistic system which, while founded on Epicurus and Lucretius, had been so modified as to be acceptable to Christian ideology. It's in no small part, and I dare say it is probably almost exclusively down to the rediscovery of Lucretius and the Democritean atomic theory contained in it, that our own age of enlightenment and subsequent scientific revolutions came about. We probably couldn't have had modern atomic theory without this ancient philosophical idea. How did they come up with atoms in the ancient world? Nobody knows. They had no way of testing these theories, although it's a kind of logical deduction that can be made with sort of blue skies thinking. Yeah, we owe a lot to Lucretius. The next poet I'm going to talk about, but only briefly, is Sextus Aurelius Propertius, born 55 BC, died after about 16 BC in Rome, not a very long life. He was the greatest elegiac poet of ancient Rome, elegies being about sort of love poetry, or often poetry of sadness. He wrote 4 books of elegies published in 29 BC, called Cynthia, after its heroine. The first of his 4 books was called the Cynthia, after its heroine, his mistress, whose real name was probably Hostia. It gained him entry into the literary circle centered around a man named Mykonos. Mykonos was Augustus Caesar's, we might call him minister of culture, although he's a kind of minister without portfolio. Essentially, anyone who wanted imperial favor had to go through Mykonos, and Propertius was one of his circle. Not a lot of details are known about Propertius's life. His father died when he was still a boy, but he was given a good education by his mother. Part of the family estate was confiscated in 40 BC for the settlement of Octavian's troops, later the Emperor Augustus, after the civil wars. His income was diminished, but he was never really poor. And some of his friends in Rome included the poet Ovid as well, so he was part of a literary circle of up-and-coming poets in that period. In many respects, he's an imperial poet, but I've included him here amongst the late Republican ones, if only for his uniqueness. He was at the heart of the late Republican literary phenomenon, and for some odd reason, he's generally ignored except by specialists. Why is he ignored? Well, he's not easy reading, first of all. His language is heavily loaded with mythological references, some very obscure, which keep the reader going back and forth to the reference books and the footnotes. But the same could be said of Ovid, who appears automatically in every sort of classics anthology. Propertius' language is clear and pure in its vocabulary. Perhaps the fact that he didn't influence modern literature heavily, except for the case of Ezra Pound, as it happens, may be working against his reputation. His work, his heavy use of myth and feeling behind that is sort of an overly Alexandrian spirit. But what separates Propertius from most of the poets of his day is how introspective he is. He pulls off the masks of personality, continuously exposing genuine feelings about love, life, and the strange ways he finds himself reacting to people around him. We're accustomed to that. That's very modern. Maybe Propertius actually belongs more to the modern era. He's unusual for the day, for his own time, and would be unusual until really the 20th century. In a sense, he's the most psychological of the Roman poets. He devoutly monitors himself and tells all in his poems, exposing things which the likes of Virgil would never have condescended to note, or which Horace dared not to mention in his poetry. As a result, one sees behind the finish of the poems a wide assortment of apprehensions, hesitations, and above all, fears. There are episodes of self-revelation. The two phases of what is now recognized of a single poem are a perfect clinical account of the manic depressive syndrome state. So he seems to have identified manic depression or bipolarism a long time ago. A poem in Book 5 of his first book shows his fear of a powerful woman who is in a love-hate relationship with him, and also another rival with whom he can now dare to feel close in recognition of their common problems and domineering females. The last poem of his first book is an ignored little gem, which in 10 lines outlines the problems of who am I in terms of recent history and the bloody battlefield of the civil wars. So again, a poet of his day who suffered. He lost part of his land in the Civil War. This is what he writes from Book 1, Chapter 22, 1 through 10. You ask always in friendship, Tullus, what are my household gods, and of what race I am. If our country's graves at Perusia are known to you, Italy's graveyard in the darkest times, when Rome's citizens dealt in war, and to my special sorrow Etruscan dust, you allowed my kinsman's limbs to be scattered, you covered his wretched bones with no scrap of soil. Know that Umbria, rich in fertile ground, bore me, where it touches here on the plain below. So in answering the question, who are you, where you're from, he's giving you a kind of a potted biography of the Civil War and the loss. Most of his elegies are concerned with personal feelings and complex emotions. There's a kind of psychological frankness lacking in many other poets of that or any era. In the ancient world, certainly. What poet dares tell us about coming in drunk to see his lady gently sleeping, himself stunned into silence and forbearance, at which point she wakes and berates him savagely for his bad ways? He stands still, hearing but saying nothing, because for him there's nothing to say. It's remarkably introspective and revelatory. In the last poem of the last book, Cornelia's ghost, rising above the smoke of the pyre, speaks in virtually legal terms an elaborate defense to her husband at the funeral ceremony, validating her people, her ancestry, her life and death. The man who wrote this magnificent and proud characterization of Roman personality knew a great deal about the Romans, and to write this he must have known a great deal about himself too. Perhaps it is the depth of this remarkable self-perception behind the guise of some Alexandrian poetic smartness which has set off scholars and critics of the Latin literary scene. We have to remember that about 70 years ago there was a great revulsion against the appearance of the act of psychological divesting in the modern movement, and a certain amount of that view lasted into the second half of the 20th century. Since many classicists are basically conservative and often anti-modern, one can wonder if Propertius's frank personal content and the act of psychological unveiling of the self may have been a kind of secret reason for this neglect. But what we have in Propertius is a Roman starting to examine himself intuitively and crudely in some of the ways in which Freud in the 1890s was examining himself with his own self-analysis carefully and precisely. There may be something unsettling about this situation, especially since it seems out of joint with the historical chain of causal relationships which we tout under the flag of Western civilization. But what Propertius was doing has, as far as we know, few antecedents and no developments apart from in modern, very modern poetry and psychology. Hence, to some accustomed to tight causal links in literary history, he may seem out of step with his time, or more specifically with our expectations. If you read Propertius attentively, with attention to his unveiling of his self, or possibly better, without a Freudian background, one will come away with a feeling of having dealt with a real person who has elements of what we expect in a personality. You don't find this in most of the other poets, apart from Catholis, and we'll come to him next, who's concerned with the human condition. And that's our next poet, Gaius Valerius Catholis. Born 84 BC in Verona, Cisalpine Gaul, died around 54 BC in Rome. A Roman poet whose expressions of love and hatred are generally considered to be the finest lyric poetry of ancient Rome. In 25 of his poems, he speaks of his love for a woman he calls Lesbia, whose identity is uncertain. Other poems by Catholis are scurrilous outbursts of contempt or hatred for Julius Caesar and other personages. No extant biography of Catholis survives. A few facts can be pieced together from external sources in the works of his contemporaries or later writers, supplemented by inferences drawn from his own poems, some of which are certain, some of which are only possible. The unembroidered certain facts are few. Catholis was alive sometime around 54 BC until that point on the evidence of 4 of his poems, and died young, according to the poet Ovid, at the age of 30, it's stated by St. Jerome, writing about the end of the 4th century, who also nevertheless dated his life erroneously. Catholis was thus a contemporary of the statesman Cicero, of Pompey Magnus, and Julius Caesar, who are variously addressed by him in his poems. He preceded the poets of the immediately succeeding age of the Emperor Augustus, among whom were Horace and Tibullus and Ovid. He was born in Verona in northern Italy. We know that from his poems. He was therefore a native of Cisalpine Gaul, that's Gaul this side of the Alps, and he owned property at Sirmio, modern Sirmione, on Lake Garda, though he preferred to live in Rome and owned a villa near the Roman suburb of Tibur in an unfashionable neighborhood. According to an anecdote in the Roman biographer Suetonius' Life of Julius Caesar, Catulus' father was Caesar's friend and host when Caesar was in Cisalpine Gaul. But the son nevertheless lampooned not only the future dictator, but also his son-in-law Pompey Magnus and his agent and military engineer Mamera, with a scurrility that Caesar admitted was personally damaging and would leave its mark on history. The receipt of an apology was followed by an invitation to dinner the same day, we're told, and Caesar's relationship with the father continued uninterrupted. Suetonius cites the episode as an example of Caesar's clemency. Julius Caesar supposedly said that those few lines of Catulus did more damage to him than all the attacks by all the Gauls during his war there. We can externally date a number of the reports of his poems, references to events that were going on at the time. These are essentially the facts. It's accepted he was born in 84, that he died around 54. We know about his hospitality, his father's hospitality to Caesar, when Caesar was governor of the province. But it could have been in Rome as well. Suetonius doesn't indicate the time. We know that a yacht retired from active service and celebrated in an iambic poem may have been Catulus's, built in Bithynia in northwestern Asia Minor, therefore available to convey him on his way back to Sirmio. So a few details. We think it's thought that the woman Lesbia may have been a woman named Claudia, who was a patrician woman. There are 3 Claudia sisters of Cicero's foe, Publius Clodius Pulcher. You might remember him from the Pompey Magnus lesson. He'll be a figure in Julius Caesar as well. So it looks like Lesbia is Claudia, who was his sister. If so, she was probably the one who married the aristocrat Metellus Celer, who was consul in 60 BC, who in 62 was governor of Cisalpine Gaul. It may have been at that time that the youthful poet first met her and possibly fell in love. It's romantic to think so. She's accorded a vivid, if unflattering, portrait in Cicero's Procailio, in which the author had occasion to blacken her character in order to defend his client against Clodia's charge that as her lover, after her husband's death, he had tried to poison her. The client was Marcus Caelius Rufus, conceivably the Rufus reproached by Catulus in poem 77 as a trusted friend who had destroyed his happiness. But if so, the Caelius of poem 100 is a different person. We'll be looking at some of those poems in more detail in time to come. The collection, his collection of poetry largely survives. I put more details about them in the notes. And in some 37 instances, the poet uniquely converts verse forms to serve as vehicles of feelings and observations expressed by beauty and wit on the one hand, or passion on the other, as to rank them in modern terms, as to rank him in modern terms as among the masters of the European lyric. He's the peer of Sappho and Shelley, of Burns and Heine. In fact, Sappho is a major influence on Catholis, as are the Alexandrian poets, as I mentioned. He's what we call a neoteric or new poet, and is writing in this new short style. He does have a few longer poems. In his longer ones, he produces studies that deeply influence the writers and poets of the Augustan age. There are some marriage hymns, a frenzied cult hymn of emasculation about a priest of Cybele, one romantic narrative in hexameters on the marriage of Peleus to the sea goddess Thetis, and 4 elegiac pieces consisting of an epistle or letter introducing a translation of an elegant conceit by the Alexandrian poet Callimachus, followed by a pasquinade or scurrilous conversation between the poet and a door, a poor quality, perhaps a youthful effort, poor quality poem. Lastly, a soliloquy, unless indeed this is actually 2 poems, addressed to a friend and cast in the form of an encomium or poem of praise. The Augustan poet Virgil is content to imitate Catholis without naming him, even going as far in the Aeneid as thrice to borrow whole lines out of Catholis's work. Horace both imitated him and criticized him. Tibullus, Propertius, and Ovid, and later Martial, all imitate and affectionately commemorate him. In his lifetime, he was the poet's poet, addressing himself as a fellow craftsman, especially to his friend Licinius Calvus, who is often posthumously commemorated along with him. It's now fashionable to identify this coterie as the poetae novi, or the neoteric new poets, who preferred the learned elusiveness and mannered and meticulous art of the Alexandrian poets to the grandiose but archaic style of Ennius, the father of Roman poetry. The school was criticized by Cicero and by Horace, who names Calvus and Catulus as members. Modern influences include Gerard Manley Hopkins, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the Romantics. For the general reader, the 25 Lesbia poems are likely to remain the most memorable, recording as they do a love affair that could register ecstasy and despair and all the divided emotions that intervene. We'll be looking at some of those in class as well, but crucially, as I say, a number of the poems are critical of political figures of the day, like Caesar, and Pompey was a friend of Cicero's. And I'll compare some of Catulus's work to modern social media, especially the Lesbia poems, because these poems were published, they were put into book form, and you could buy them. But when he would write one, he would make multiple copies and post them on notice boards around the city of Rome. So this is the ancient equivalent of social media. And people would read these poems, and they would be about, his love affair with Lesbia or his love affair with someone else. And they would know the people. That the people reading the poems would be acquainted with, in many cases, some of the characters involved. So when he complains and when he criticizes Lesbia, it has the quality of a kind of trashing someone's reputation on Facebook or something along those lines, or Instagram or Twitter. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now, and look forward to looking at some of the poems of Catulus in the lesson in class. Thank you very much for your attention.